and welcome to the last installment of this web-based lecture series on post-stroke fatigue. I am Wesley Green, a third-year Doctor of Occupational Therapy student at the University of the Pacific, and let's just get right into it. Just a reminder of our learning objectives. Since the first video, we have been chipping away at these, and today we will complete our final two, applying a structured framework to evaluation and treatment selection to enhance clinical decision-making, and mapping evaluation and treatment methods to post-stroke fatigue mechanisms to enhance plan of care development and documentation. The plan for this video is to begin by discussing the role of assessment and intervention in treating post-stroke fatigue, transitioning then into discussing the targeting of neural mechanisms in post-stroke fatigue treatment, and then wrapping up with some simple documentation examples to hopefully round out what we discussed today. Begin first by discussing the role of assessment and intervention in post-stroke fatigue treatment. Before we get too far into discussing the evaluation selection and the logic behind it, I wanted to first reinforce the cycle of breakdown and reintroduce what's the loops that are going on in task performance in those with post-stroke fatigue that leads to increased perceived effort, early termination, and ongoing fatigue. So on the right, we have that step-by-step breakdown. We have reduced sensory attenuation, going into prediction feedback mismatch. This is where the brain is less capable to suppress internally generated sensations. So they are then taken as feedback sometimes. So the balance between what's predicted and what we know is there and what is coming into the system is mismatched. This increases sensory prediction errors as those internal generated sensations are perceived as external errors to the task we are trying to complete. This increases the cost or the effort needed for sensory reweighting and increasing precision weighting because we need to filter even further. Was that from us? Was that from the environment? What is going on? And then the mechanistic factor that we saw in Kilkenny et al. 2023 is there's an increase in cerebellar and somatosensory processing. There's two pathways here. Remember, there's S1 in the supplementary motor area. One is attenuated and the plan sticks to the original plan, and the other goes to update the internal model because that error was high. It was interpreted as a big error, needs to update the plan. That update is not always necessary, so then that takes further cognitive effort to then try to reduce, try to suppress, so that the task can continue moving on. So there's increased neural processing demands, which increases the neural inefficiency due to, one, the impaired connectivity at the cellular level that we talked about in the first lecture. If you need to go back and revisit it, please do. And then the systems that are impaired by those that reduced connectivity are now being forced to operate at a higher level than they were, even before the stroke, sometimes. And this does not have the capacity to do that effectively. So there's increased perceived error. Because it's literally taking more metabolic cost, more computational cost to figure out what is going on, and then the actual cost of the task itself. And then we see that illustrated in this closed loop model here on the left, where we have essentially broken down sensory attenuation and the impairments to the internal state, the internal model, in the red dotted lines over here on that recursive error processing side. Going over onto that left side, that blue dotted line, which we'll be considering the sensory reweighting. That is the external, or things that are perceived as external, being processed, weighted, and decided what is best and most important based on the reliability of the signal and the relevance to the task. And it is, let me get a little pointer, this balance right here, the balance between the incoming and the outgoing, the attenuated and the reweighted, this is where treatment assessment is all focusing on. Where is this balance? How far off is it from the other? And how do we get it back to what it was? Or how do we get it back to the efficient state so that things can start being automated the way that they used to? So extrapolating a bit from the cellular and those sensory processing impairments and the impairments in sensory motor integration when it comes to predictive processing, we look at the triple network model and how it navigates our cognitive functioning, our hierarchy of learning on the right. On the triple network model being the default mode, central executive, and the salience networks. The default mode being in charge of setting our internal states, managing that internal model, and holding everything into automaticity that can be. The central executive being the exact opposite, being in charge of filtering everything that's going on, making sense of everything for task completion, problem solving, and maintaining performance throughout the day. And then we have the salience network, whose job it is to determine what's necessary for cognitive action, what can be automated. And through that is how we navigate our executive function and our cognition to be able to grab hold of our capacities and rise to the challenge of every task that we need to do in the day. When you think of that process of post-stroke fatigue and how sensory attenuation compounds upon sensory reweighting, making the sensory image difficult, fuzzy. Everything that's coming in is coming in, one, into an impaired network at the cellular level, and then two, the processing is impaired, the image is too blurry, it's hard to determine what's relevant for the task, what's important, and what's not. So the salience network is just kicking everything it can to the central executive network. If it can't determine it, it says, I'm not sure what this is, I need your help figuring it out. And while this is a static image here, this kind of fluctuates. This will fluctuate throughout the day for any individual, somebody without a stroke or neurological impairment, but specifically for those with stroke. Because while this is a transient episode for those without a stroke who just have, if you've got poor sleep, you're tired, hungry, these things happen to us. But for those with post-stroke fatigue, this is now their base. The degrees to which the central executive and the imbalance in between the triple network, the three networks, is going to be near impossible for us as clinicians to determine without EEG, for one thing, and then two, it's just going to be difficult to determine when it's coming without assessment, without knowing what to look for and what to test. So while this image has this going on, remember it fluctuates. There's some parts where the central executive can slow back down, and there's times where they can't. It is determined by task complexity, whether that's the level of the cognitive energy it takes, or the longer a task goes on. The longer it has to do something, the more information is coming in, the more likely it is that that's going to be kicked up to the central executive so it can take more of the role of the control of the task. To help kind of explain it a little bit better, at least this helps me explain it a little bit better. If you have a preference for Gestalt language learning as well, this might help you instead of having to break down everything going on further. So essentially what we see at its core is a sensory motor integration failure. There's a great imbalance between our predicted motion and the actual results of the task. And the greater that distance is, the difference between those two things, the greater the impairment is going to be. Because the greater the gap, the brain and body have to figure out how to cover. And if the gap is too big, it simply just won't, because it can't. So essentially what you have is a sensory motor integration failure. We can look at the ascending tracts, the incoming information, as the sensory reweighting, and the pyramidal, extrapyramidal motor tracts essentially as sensory attenuation, because that's the signal that the efference copy comes from. The plan that goes out from those tracks is the same attenuated, predicted plan that we make. And so when that image is blurry and the brain can't decide what's going on, there's confusion. It doesn't know which way is which, doesn't know what that is, how relevant is that to the task, should I focus on it? I don't know. And so it's confused. In that thought process of trying to figure out the first thing of what we're even seeing, feeling, perceiving, drains the patient before they can even start the task a lot of the time. This helped me I hope it helps you. If the other way isn't clear to you and this way is a little bit clearer, essentially at its core is a sensory motor integration failure. Making a plan costs extra energy. And then if that plan is far off from the actual consequences, it's even more, because then we have to correct at a greater level. So our job really, as we get into it, is going to be making that gap between the incoming information and the outgoing or the attenuated plan shorter, so that mitigating that gap mid-task or to start a task isn't such a colossal undertaking by the central nervous system. we're transitioning into evaluation and assessment selection coming up here soon. I first wanted to start with just discussing the guiding theories and core concepts behind this framework, this approach to addressing post-stroke fatigue and targeting these neural mechanisms. Beginning with motor learning performance theory, really focusing on those stages of learning, the cognitive, the associative, and the automatic. The automatic is where you're typically at now. The routine tasks that we have, those are automatic, those are set. The way you reach for your phone, the way you brush your teeth, the way you get dressed, those are routine and those are set. Post-stroke, individuals are essentially knocked down a motor learning stage depending on the severity of the stroke, leading them into a more associative and sometimes more cognitive for tasks that were still kind of new or required higher levels of skill. And we were applying this theory to this because we were essentially moving them back through these motor learning stages, trying to get everything back up to automaticity. We'll automate everything that was already automated, really those routine tasks, and getting them back up to the level of performance so that if they want to learn something new, they still have that capacity. And again, we'll really be focusing on the closed loop system. It's feedback dependent and it's required for sustained action. The next guiding theory is sensory processing theory. As we were looking at the balance between sensory reweighting and sensory attenuation and their impact on predictive processing and sensory motor integration falls right in line. We were addressing sensory processing errors, both at an individual level and then their culminating impact on predictive processing and sustained action. To guide this towards occupational performance, we'll be applying the PEOP model, the person, environment, occupation, and performance model, widely used in stroke rehab and one of my favorites. We understand that performance arises through the dynamic interaction of the person, the task, and the environment. And in this case, as we went over in the last lecture, the sensory processing errors sit into the person, sets them into a point where the environment is now requiring so much more effort to just exist in. And then there's the demands of the tasks. And then there's the impacts of performance. Actually completing the task, in this case in post-stroke fatigue, leads to increased sensory processing, and this whole impaired sensory processing cycle of sensory reweighting, attenuation, and their impact on performance and predictive processing is just a self-fulfilling loop that continues to happen and drain energy so long as the task is continued. And so our goal is to, again, reduce the gap between, improve the sensory processing error so that the gap between the predicted and the actual is smaller, and that the balance between the person, the environment, and their occupation can come back into a level of symmetry so that occupational performance can thrive. With that in mind, we talk the logic of assessment selection and the role of evaluation for those with post-stroke fatigue. What we're looking at is identifying the sensory processing impairments that are driving task breakdown. This may be sensory reweighting and sensory attenuation. It may be one or the other. The goal is to figure out which one is it and to what extent is it impacting performance. So define the conditions that expose the deficit. When is it emerging? Why is it emerging? So we can figure out how to test it, how to drive it. Establish mechanism-based targets for intervention, so we can align our treatments and our interventions with that same way. And then, of course, anchoring baseline performance for comparison across the plan of care. This is in documentation. This is so we can show that what we're targeting is improving, and so is their performance, so that we can effectively tie everything in to skilled clinical work and keep everything progressing for these patients. So the goal of evaluation is to establish baseline sensory processing impairments, map the return to automaticity with task performance, and quantify the impact of post-stroke fatigue on task performance. On its flip side, the goals of intervention and the logic behind its selection is to improve the baseline sensory processing impairments identified in the evaluation, drive the return to automaticity with task performance, and reduce the impact of post-stroke fatigue on task performance. The role of the intervention is to systematically manipulate the identified processing deficits, start that shift from a feedback dependence to that automated performance. So shortening the gap between the predicted and the output and the actual, improve the integration under task-specific demands, reduce functional impact of post-stroke fatigue through restoring automaticity, drive consistent, efficient task performance. We are looking for things to be level. We don't want them crashing early, or anything like that. We are looking for consistency over everything else. And then update everything based on the response to intervention across plan of care, as we always do. Find that just right challenge, grade it adequately, terminate it when it needs to be terminated. So now finally, after 2.5 lectures, we get into targeting neural mechanisms in post-stroke fatigue. As we get into this, I want to preface that we will be discussing them individually, reweighting, attenuation, and predictive processing, discussing those and then we'll get into kind of explaining how it would look altogether. And remember, we are looking for mapping individually first, and then they're culminated, because sensory reweighting and sensory attenuation both have impacts of their own. They are both individually impaired sensory processes that have a combined impact on task performance through predictive processing. And so we are tracking both individually, both together through predictive processing, and then their impact on performance through perceived effort. Beginning with sensory reweighting, this brief kind of review slide, this is the dynamic prioritization of sensory input. The key function is dynamic gain control, adjusting neural weights based on signal reliability. Remember, this isn't magnitude. The magnitude of the signal coming in is not as important as its reliability and its relevance to the task. Using that movie theater example again, when the sun bleaches your retinas when you leave that movie theater, that is a strong, high magnitude signal, but it is not reliable. And sensory reweighting processes help us understand that. So then we have resolved sensory conflict. That's switching between visual, vestibular, and somatosensory. When your eyes are bleached, you switch to the other two. And it allows contextual adaptation. It is continually updating as the environment changes so that we can adapt in real time to what is going on, to avoid error, to avoid safety risks or any type of danger as well. Its role in performance is driving precision, dynamic adaptation, balancing signals, and error filtering. Put simply, the nervous system continually adjusts reliance on sensory inputs to optimize movement and perception. Sensory reweighting is how we understand not only what we're doing, but how to keep doing it and how to adapt to the world around us. And when it is impaired, our capacities for adaptation significantly reduce. When we're looking for impairments in sensory reweighting, what we expect to see is rigid dependence on a preferred sensory input, which typically we see is visual dependence. General instability, increased fall risk, poor adaptation to sensory conflict. So when things start to come in at a high rate or things are confusing, you could see freezing, you can see a fall, or you can just see extremely slowed movement, and that's when you really see the visual dependency. They'll start washing their feet, they'll start washing their hands because the adaptation is so low. Reduced postural control in dynamic environments. They have reduced postural control in general. We went over that study by Dewan and Awosika, and in general, they hold themselves tight, they shrink tighter to bring their center of gravity in, which makes them more rigid and makes them less capable of adaptation with movement or significant perturbation. And increased movement variability. They're not sure what's going on, right? Can't plan or stick to a plan of movement with these impairments. So clinically, what we're trying to restore in these patients is flexible sensory integration, the appropriate weighting of between vision, vestibular sense, and somatosensory input so they can stop being so heavily reliant on vision. Improving postural stability and efficient movement adaptation so that they can have the fluidity of movement that humans have so that they can do the tasks that they need to do at the level that they want to do them at. Research thus far, there are several ways to target sensory reweighting in both assessment and treatment. Anything that varies sensory input or requires them to maintain a task or do something and adapt some level of sensory integration is going to test and sensory reweighting. Some examples being the modified clinical test of sensory interaction and balance, Schaffner-Romberg. These two are very similar, but they show you static balance under compliant and non-compliant environments. The Brock string assessment shows you impact of binocular vision and changes in adaptation, integration, visual coordination. Any dynamic balance under altered sensory conditions, a four square step test, what's that called? Tug test with some type of weight, uncompliant surface, eyes, maybe not eyes covered, it's not the safest, but vision included, any type of way where they have to dynamically switch between or take in information is going to assess reweighting. Functional mobility with visual complex environments. Obstacle courses, grocery store, stuff like that. Anything that's going to be very loud sensory-wise, so maybe loud literally, but bright, a lot of people, a lot of movement, a lot of things going on. Anything that's going to tax the exteroceptive systems is going to allow you to assess and treat sensory reweighting. Some ways that have been shown to vestibular rehabilitation has been shown directly to improve post-stroke fatigue, and that is as simple as vestibular ocular exercises or full-on movements up and down, changing with level shifts. Anything that has a conflict, anything that requires them to determine what is going on in the external is going to target sensory reweighting. And if you're checking for an assessment, you want to check and see what their response is to that. When their eyes focus on the Brock string or when they go vision adjust, do they lose balance? Do they get fatigued? In the Romberg, is it the second that the eyes close that they lose balance, or they have to switch, or do they have a second? Can they make it to the sharpened one? Their response to the adaptation is our assessment. And then just our treatments are testing them. Vestibular rehabilitation techniques, proprioceptive training, anything that gets these exteroceptive systems and the peripheral sensation going is going to test the patient's capacity for sensory reweighting or train the patient's capacity for sensory reweighting. Just 3 set assessments that I decided to choose that work very well, in my opinion, for sensory reweighting. Again, we have the clinical test of sensory interaction and balance and the modified. This allows you to get the Romberg and Schocken-Romberg as well as with the compliant, non-compliant surfaces and it requires the full face covering. So vision is truly occluded and it's not just eyes closed with the capacity to open and see what's going on. The 4 square step test gives you a more dynamic aspect of their sensory reweighting and their sensory motor integration and as a whole. As they move through those 4 steps, being able to pick up the foot, maintain direction, and not have a fall or a slip or anything like that really shows you their capacities for higher level balance skills. And then the Brock string again, showing you how to affect changes in binocular vision and visual coordination. And with each one of these, you will be assessing their response. So with the 4 square step test, typically if you use it, say for an individual with Parkinson's, you're looking for the time. The time is still what we'll use to measure, but we're really looking for their response. How much effort did it take? How much effort did they think it was going to take? How much effort did it really take? Did one round for the 4 square step test, did it take them out? Or were they not even able to get to the 4 square step test because the CTSIB took them out? That is what we're looking for with the assessment of sensory reweighting. We are looking for their response to the dynamic balancing of sensory input. And for whatever that task is under. The Brock string and the CT-SIB, those are pretty stationary. This is what you're doing. With the 4 square step test, it's a little bit more. It's dynamic. They're moving forward and back, left and right, weight shifting, going over to one foot. It tests a lot more. So it's likely going to take a lot more out of them. But understanding their response to these adaptations and sensation and sensory processing tells us how sensory reweighting is impacting their performance. In comparison to sensory reweighting, which is the external, it is our capacity to take in the world around us, compare it to the world within, and determine how we're going to go about going on. Sensory attenuation is the internal. It determines our internal model. It sets our base resting state. It's the brain's capacity again to suppress self-generated, expected internal sensation. Its key function is that prediction-based filtering suppresses expected sensory feedback. That is, remember from the last lecture, the efference copy. That signal sent to tell the body, this is what we're doing, this is how it should feel. And then essentially anything that doesn't feel like this is some type of error. And it is the balance between the distance between the predicted and the actual that determines how strong that error signaling is. The self-other differentiation, distinguishing the self-generated from the external sensations. And then sensory gain control, prioritizing unexpected or behaviorally relevant input. When sensory attenuation is impaired, more things are prioritized as unexpected and behaviorally relevant. That is why it attempts to update the internal model, and that is where increases in perceived effort come from. The role in performance is reducing sensory overload, optimizing attention, improves movement efficiency, enhances prediction accuracy by setting that baseline efforts copy, letting us know what's expected, and supports accurate perceived effort. It lets us know that what we expected to happen happened at the level that we expected to. Throughout the day, throughout tasks, throughout performance, the nervous system selectively attenuates predictable sensory signals to optimize perception and motor control. It attenuates, again, I'm going to keep repeating it, what is irrelevant to the task so that we can focus on adapting to the changing environment around us so that we can complete the task. And when it is impaired, that's where things get all wonky. Clinically, what are we looking for when there's sensory attenuation failure, when there's impairments? We're seeing that increased perceived effort during movement. What they expect to happen takes much more effort than what actually happened. There's sensory overload during routine tasks, where the routine task gets more and more difficult. The noise of processing becomes louder and louder and louder. There's reduced movement automaticity because there is a dependence on feedback, overtaxing that sensory reweighting system. Heightened awareness of self-generated sensations, that's a reduction of the loss suppression, so that more internal signals are now being processed and updated as external air that needs to be updating the internal model, which leads to early task disengagement and fatigue. The process, this is one of the mechanisms, the process of trying to update the internal model costs energy. It takes time. It has metabolic costs in the brain, and it has a cost physically to complete the task. So clinically, what we are targeting, what we're trying to restore, is that attenuation of predictable sensory input, so we can get that solid efference copy, that map of what we expect to happen. Improve sensory motor prediction, again based off that efference copy. Reduce unnecessary sensory processing, and enhance movement automaticity. The unnecessary processing comes from the impairment in general. So if we can improve sensory attenuation, we can reduce the amount of unnecessary sensory processing because it will just be suppressed the way it's supposed to. And by that, it enhances movement automaticity because the difference between the predicted and the feedback, the expected and the actual, is either non-existent or so close that it no longer requires conscious effort. Now, when it comes to targeting sensory attenuation, there are a few methods. Now, there's a couple that I know that I found to be, they're still kind of, their reliability and things are still kind of being tested and true, but these methods are being used. They are used greatly in F&D, functional neurologic disorder, as well as other conditions like schizophrenia, where the nervous system in the central nervous system is kind of running rampant, and it's difficult to tell the difference between what's expected, what's not, and these kind of imbalanced impairments in performance that kind of span a lot of different things and a lot of different conditions as it comes to the central nervous system. And again, in here we are really focusing on task performance, task initiation, and that closed loop model and the ability to just get something done. So we're talking about force matching, pressure matching, which I'll go over on the next slide, grip and force perceived effort. So where we kind of start matching perceived effort as well, and using the Borg and the CR10, whichever ways of measuring effort is a good way of figuring out sensory attenuation. In the treatment, we're looking at high repetition, task-specific practice. In mass practice, we are just trying to set that internal model as much as possible. Get that thing recalibrated so that they can start making predictions again. So anything rhythmic and repetitive, errorless learning, graded motor practice, external cue fading to promote automaticity, that's really important, and progressive functional task progression. Again, that is grading. Grading the way it needs to be graded, the grading the way we do, finding that just right challenge and pushing them to the highest levels of performance. So the assessments for sensory attenuation really for us will really break down into force effort matching and sensory gating. And we'll first start by talking about force effort matching. This is complex, but pretty simple to understand and implement. All you really need is either a scale or a dynamometer, just something to measure the amount of force being produced by the patient. It's simple. You'll instruct the patient with a hand dynamometer to give all the amount of effort they can, 10 out of 10, and you're going to note that number. You'll then instruct the patient to match that percentage of the full effort, 30, 10, if it's 5 out of 10, whatever it is. And you'll note that number as well. And just for matching, you'll compare the results with the patient's reported effort and see where it is. So if the patient did a 10 out of 10 on the first one, and they shoot for a 3 out of 10 on the second one, and then you then ask them for, say, a 6 out of 10. You take whatever number they get on the dynamometer. The number itself is not the most important thing at this point. That perceived error is. That rate of perceived exertion is. So if they shot for a 3, they tell you it was a 6, and it was about 10% of the first number, you know that's off. And that gives you your baseline. That is how far off it is. You'll repeat it 3 to 5 times. As of yet, there's no average for this. You kind of just take the trials and see where they're at. And you're looking for the exertion number to start matching, and the actual number on the dynamometer to start matching as well. Sensory gating using a pressure cuff is very similar, not the same thing, just using a pressure cuff. What you'll do is inflate the cuff anywhere on the body. What the beautiful thing is, we're not taking blood pressure here. We're just applying external pressure to the body and asking the patient to match it. So the more you vary the location of the pressure, the more they have to work. So that would be a grade up. So say we're just taking at the arm still over the brachial artery. You'll inflate the cup to a specific level, say 135 millimeters of mercury, deflate it, have the patient inflate it themselves to try to match it. If you only have a digital one, just don't have them. You try to have them start and stop it, and don't let them see it. You'll compare the results and know the difference. So if the number you set is 135 and they stop it at 60, you see that they have their sensory attenuation is off. That pressure that they are perceiving is off from what it is. If they give you like a 65, you know it's way off. So you compare the results, know the difference, repeat again, and repeat. The repetition is for consistency, so you get a consistent reading. Because there's no average, there's nothing that we're just checking to see. We're looking for the matching of the numbers. For the force effort matching, the first thing we're looking for on assessment, we're looking for the perceived exertion. So they said 3 out of 10, they give you a 6 out of 10, that's how far off the perceived exertion is in that sensory attenuation. For the sensory gating and the blood pressure cuff, the farther they are off from the number that was set initially shows you kind of the level of impact to some degree of sensory attenuation and their internal model that they have currently. And over time and repetition, we're looking for those numbers to even out, for them to get closer to the blood pressure cuff number, and for the RPEs, for the force effort, to match. And then again at the end, for the force, the actual force from the dynamometer to match as well. We are playing a matching game with this one. Moving on now to the combined aspect, the culmination of sensory attenuation and sensory reweighting in task performance. We're going to discuss now predictive processing. This is the brain continuously predicting sensory outcomes and updating those predictions using incoming sensory feedback. Reliant upon feedback, reliant upon intact sensory reweighting. Right? Key functions: prediction generation creates the internal models of expected sensory outcomes. Prediction error processing detects the mismatch between expected and actual input. And model updating refines predictions based on new sensory information. So those functions right there, both of them require intact, balanced sensory attenuation and sensory reweighting. With impaired sensory reweighting, we see increased attempts to update the internal model. Increased prediction error processing because more internal signals are being interpreted as external and being interpreted as errors. And then prediction generation from the beginning, from rest, is impaired because our internal model and our capacity for suppressing self-generated motion and self-generated sensory stimulation is impaired. Its role in performance is improving movement accuracy, supporting adaptive motor learning, optimizing sensory integration, minimizing prediction error, and reducing neural process demands. And again, put in simply TLDR, the nervous system continuously compares predicted and actual sensory feedback to guide perception and action. At its core, it requires, again, I'm going to keep harping on this, sensory reweighting and sensory attenuation to be intact, to be balanced, to be precise, to be able to ideate, initiate, and sustain action at any level of performance. It is needed. Both of those processes are needed. One can be to some degree impaired, and usually is. Again, and you'll notice probably already I continue to say we when I'm explaining these processes because these are processes by which we all move. And throughout the day we fluctuate in these processes as well. The difference between us and those who have had a stroke is that they are locked into this impaired feedback state, making life more difficult to live. Somebody has these impairments and a predictive processing impairment, clinically what we're looking for, what we expect, is increased reliance on feedback-dependent control, increased reliance on the central executive actively analyzing all the information coming in so that it can make a decision for them to do. This leads to delayed or inaccurate movement adjustments, delayed because the process takes too long for full cognitive control to be in control of everything, and inaccurate because calculations couldn't be done in time, or they were based off of bad priors, that poor internal model. So we see overall reduced motor efficiency, specifically in novel or complex tasks. New learning and learning new tasks is difficult. And obviously a more difficult task is going to be more difficult as well. They have a heightened perceived uncertainty during performance. That is the increased number of errors. Essentially, when the brain, the CNS, is trying to summate all this information while the task is happening, it simply can't. So it moves off of uncertainty. It's essentially guessing out what's going to happen next, expecting the central executive to be able to determine what's next going to happen on its own. It's no longer predicted, and we are reacting. They are reacting. The prediction is gone, and we're now reacting to a set of movements that we put into place. Essentially, laying the track after the train is taken, after the train is left. This leads to increased perceived effort in predictable routine activities. What we're trying to restore clinically is accurate internal model formation, efficient prediction feedback integration, reduced prediction error during movement, and improved anticipatory motor control. We have to shift them from the reactive state of action that they are in back to the predictive. We need to lay the tracks before the train leaves. And this gets them back. This minimizes the imbalance between prediction and feedback, minimizes the gap, the correction gap between the predicted and the actual, making it just a little bit more easy to do things. Fun thing about targeting predictive processing is that there's a million ways to do it. Some of the best assessments being reaction time task, serial reaction, new task, repeated task performance with comparison, functional task adaptation over repeated trials, and performance consistency across repetitions. One of my favorite ones when it comes to like novel or repeated task, functional task adaptations, is forcing a time constraint onto the task. It has, I don't know, in my limited experience working with patients in general, it helps. It's a performance aspect. It forces them to have to perform instead of giving them all the time that they need, which is more realistic in life. You rarely have all the time you need, and you're forced to make a decision. And when your decision-making process is impaired, it reduces a lot of participation. So in treatment, we're looking for repetitive task practice with greater complexity, error augmentation, error-reduced learning, motor learning-based interventions with blocked or random practice, feed-forward training, anticipatory actions, and dual task and variability-based training. Just they have to learn to adapt. We are going from making it safe and simple to progressing in complexity in both the task and the environment so that they need to adapt more. We are training their ability for adaptation. While there are many ways to assess predictive processing, some simple ways here that I'll go over are some simple reaction tests, a ruler drop test, and a serial reaction test. The ruler drop is simple as the image illustrates. Is you take the ruler, you have them place their hands towards the bottom of it, and you drop it. Where they catch it shows you there either the reaction time and just you can measure based on the inches on the ruler. You can do that 3 to 5 times. You can take an average if you want to, or you can just take the best one and see where that is. For a serial reaction test, we have this image of this patient doing the blaze pods. Appears to have a gait belt on, but there's nobody there with them, so I'm not understanding why that's there. But in this one, I'm not exactly sure what you were doing, but the way you can set this up is he's going down the line, has to step over the green cone, touch the blue button, step over the red triangle, touch the green. That is a serial reaction task. And when the light goes off, back and forth, back and forth. And you can see how you can easily work these things into greater level interventions. This is a dynamic balance training, if I've ever seen it, with serial reaction built in. This isn't cognitive motor dual tasking. This mimics, while you might not always be doing something like this in life, but it gives them the kind of complexity that going to the grocery store, having to respond to these things, even driving to some extent, these IADL, these higher level cognitive tasks can be worked into basic functional training that we're already doing. And then we have choice reaction tasks. This image doesn't really explain it the best, but what you'll have, in this one you can have both hands on the table. As the light goes off, it tells you move the right hand or the left. All right, do this, right hand grab this, right hand go across. You give them a set of rules to do when a reaction goes off. So if they have like a visual one, if the blue light goes off, they have to do something with the right hand. If the green light goes off, they have to do something with their left hand. If a red light goes off, they need to cross, make the X. Giving them a reaction to make, an action to take, and a choice to do it, and just gauging how they respond to it. In these, just like with sensory attenuation and the pressure gating, and with sensory review weighting, we are looking for the response. Well, the rural drop test, you're just straight up looking, boom, what is it? Where is the reaction test? With reaction time. With the higher level integration of these, you're also looking at their ability to do it, but also how it impacts them. And we'll get into perceived effort in the next one, but that one's a little bit shorter, and I'll just discuss it now, because you're essentially just applying the RPE scale to everything that you're doing prior to and after, and making sure that those two numbers are starting to move closer to each other, so that when they say it's a 5, it is a 5. And then the actual objective number matches, whether that's with the force effort with the dynamometer, whether that's during the choice reaction task, or if you're doing a functional task under functional observation under a time constraint, and seeing how they respond to it. Completing the task is one thing. The amount of effort and the amount of energy it takes from them is really what we're looking at when it comes to post-stroke fatigue. And then culminating, we'll finish up talking about increased perceived effort. Increased perceived effort is one of the main outcomes of these impairments in post-stroke fatigue outside of the direct sensory processing and sensory motor integration aspects of it. Increased perceived effort is one of the big ones that leads to a reduction in task performance and a complete reduction in participation if it is continued to go on. Because as I mentioned in the first, and I think it was the second lecture too, when it comes to post-stroke fatigue, rest is not improving it. So no amount of prioritization, no amount of planning, no amount of pacing, no amount of dispersion of water in spoons or cups is going to restore this energy. And over time, they'll have less and less. And the thought of doing things will have more and more effort associated with them. And social participation will drop ADL participation will drop, quality of life will drop. And so really restoring this capacity for perceived effort stems from addressing these base level sensory processing errors to reduce the amount of energy taken for simple basic processing during the day. So getting into now the perceived effort, defined as a subjective experience of how physically or mentally demanding an activity feels. Key functions are effort integration, combining sensory motor, cognitive, and interoceptive signaling, resource monitoring, estimating the cost of continuing a task, and behavioral regulation, guides the pacing, persistence, and task modification. It is trying to determine everything that is coming in, which we know from a base level is impaired, and at a neurophysiological level, even the salience network can't determine what is important and what needs to go where. And we're looking largely from a neurophysiological level. But when you extrapolate that into behavior, when everything just feels like too much, getting out of bed feels like too much, and you feel like this picture here, 4 screens, too much is going on, and you can have to just sit back. While the sensory processing impairments, the sensory motor integration issues, the predictive processing impairments, those can be trained, those can be improved at an objective level. But even when those are improved, if they are stuck in a state of increased perceived effort at a behavioral level, when they simply are interpreting life as too costly from an energy level to participate in, that's where a big issue, that is for occupational performance, for quality of life, for mental health, that is where a big issue resides. And perceived effort plays a big factor in performance. It influences task engagement. It regulates the capacity for activity pacing. It shapes movement efficiency, affects endurance, and it impacts occupational performance. Because if they start with a lowered belief in the capacity to do something, their ability to perform it or the level that they perform it at is also going to be reduced. Put simply, it is the brain's integrated estimate of the resources required to perform in sustained activity. At the end of the previous 2 lectures, I discussed how and emphasized how post-stroke fatigue is not an endurance issue, it's not a physical capacity issue. It is a resource allocation issue. And that resource allocation is impaired at the base level, at the bottom up, at the cellular level, but it's also impaired from top down, from the mental health and from the brain's perception and the behavioral aspect of performance. I think I've already said it, I'll harp on it again, but if they start considering the acts of living life to be too effortful, to cost too much, participation will decline, health will decline, quality of life will decline. So I don't want to fear monger, I don't want to make this sound like a thing I'm up on a pretty big soapbox right now, I feel like. But this is something that can be fixed. And perceived effort is a behavioral outcome of these impaired sensory processing issues. And if we can address them, we can reduce perceived effort and get people back to not just participating fully in life, but wanting to participate fully in life and believing that they can. So clinically speaking, what we're looking for when there's an impairment or somebody is living with increased perceived effort, we see is disproportionately high effort ratings for low demand tasks. That's being taken out from brushing your teeth, getting dressed, sitting there watching TV. Early onset fatigue during routine tasks, reduced task persistence, so they're terminating tasks more easily, more quickly, more sooner. Increased cognitive load during physical performance due to that increased level of sensory processing, and dissociation between objective performance and subjective effort. It's just not matching. So what we target, clinically, what we try to restore, I have that on there twice, so sorry about that. Accurate scaling of effort relative to task demand. Improve sensory motor integration of cost signals, so a better understanding and perception of what's going on and how much effort things are actually taking. Reduce overestimation of physical and cognitive demand, and finding that alignment between performance output and perceived cost. And this is what we're saying where you see those before and after each assessment, before and after a functional activity observation, is having them rate their perceived effort. What do they think it's going to take them? How much did it actually take them? You're going to have to coax some patients. They might try to fib to you. They might try to tell you it's easier than it is. But you can usually tell when they're lying about something like that. And it's very important that they're honest with themselves about this, because it's their life. They're going to have to live with the performance. We can do everything that they're going to do, but if they're not going to, So we're looking for that alignment between performance and output cost. We want things to feel the way that they think they should. That way, there's no more of this overestimating how much it is, how much participation is going to be, and so we can hopefully increase participation. Several ways of targeting perceived effort. The Borg RPE scale again. The COPM is one of my favorites because they rate it when they do it, and it keeps you focused on occupational performance at the same time. Force output versus perceived exertion tasks. It's kind of the same thing as the force matching with the hand dynamometer. Time functional tasks with effort scaling, so doing just functional ADLs, some type of occupation-based activity with a time crunch. Repeated task performance, and we're looking for consistency over those repeated tasks. When it comes to perceived effort, we're looking more for the consistency of effort necessary, and then later on we'll look for how well the task was actually completed as well. Ways to treat it and try to address it in treatment. Graded exposure to physical and cognitive demand. So if necessary, first start seated, start with more cognitive, and then add that dual task motor aspect later. Progressive resistance and aerobic training. That is in there. That definitely will impact the internal environment so that they have to regulate more of what's going on the inside. But if you are going to incorporate aerobic training or any type of resistance training, I recommend following the ACSM guidelines for stroke training. For stroke exercise, and task-specific repetition with calibrated load progression, pacing and energy management strategies. Initially, because I'm not here trying to tell you that activity modification doesn't work. In general, it has its place. Rarely will a stroke patient be dealing with solely neurologically based post-stroke fatigue. They will have metabolic and physiological fatigue. They will have amotivation. They will have other issues as well. So the pacing and the prioritization management is still necessary. But that is to support improving performance. That is not meant, in my opinion, to be a lifelong thing outside of realizing that you need to take a break sometimes. You shouldn't have to plan out your whole day if you don't absolutely have to. You should be able to adapt to whatever's coming your way. So then biofeedback, base effort calibration, the RPE anchoring, that's using the blood pressure cuff. So they have that biofeedback and we're able to see what's going on and have that confirmed or affirmed by either a mirror or something else that's bringing them a way to verify it. So simply, some assessments for perceived effort will be the combination of using the RPE scale. The CR10 is the easiest for effort perception. If you want to use the Borg 6 to 20, that is more accurate as it comes to heart rate and really monitoring that level of effort. But the 1 out of 10 is perfectly fine for this as well. If you are incorporating higher levels of activity, cognitive motor dual tasking, or even direct resistance or aerobic exercise, I do recommend switching to this 6 out of 20 Borg RPE so that you can stay within those healthy and safe heart rate ranges depending on the needs of the patient. But it's your choice. And then again, the COPM, it keeps you focused. It keeps everything occupation focused on the occupational performance. It's self-rated and what level of importance for each patient. And it already asks them how difficult the task is for them at that time. So it kind of combines these both into one. And so you can use the COPM to get during your initial assessment and evaluation to get the levels for the occupations that mean the most to them. And then you can break that down into its sensory processing pieces to incorporate sensory weighting and sensory attenuation and predictive processing into that broken down occupational activity to set up your whole treatment plan. That's at least the thought process. That's what I would do. So, and then, for example, in the next slides, I'll get into a couple just example documentation samples, one from an eval, one from a progress note. So you can kind of see how I imagine this looking and how it would look as what progression looks like with these type of measures. This first example will be just a brief evaluation sample. So you can pause the video, look at this as much as you want. I'll read through it quickly. It's just a simple one. In the subjective, we have patient reports being very fatigued with basic tasks, rating grooming and meal preparation as an RPE 7 out of 10. So we really want to have a paper trail of the patient's fatigue and the level of effort that they are reporting that is impacting their day. Objectively, in this one I use this modified CT SIB, pressure matching, force calibration, and a timed grooming task. So it's going to increase sway with eyes closed on compliant surface. Pressure matching, we have the target pressure of 60 millimeters of mercury and the reproduced pressure of 90. So there's reduced force discrimination. If the number is way over, their ability to, or under the ability to discriminate is impaired. We're looking for it to be closer. Force calibration, the predicted effort for 40 pounds at an RPE of 4. That's what they were going for. They actually got a 14, so we told them to go for half. They did 17 pounds, but they had an RPE of 6. So the number is close to half of the original number, which is great, but the RPE is higher. So we're looking for the RPEs to match, whether it's high, whether it's low, matching is good. But ideally, you also want to match the level of RPE for the task. If they're putting socks on, it's a 10 out of 10. True, that's where they are right now. But if those RPE matches, we know that perceived effort is our sensory attenuation, at least that day, is not a factor there, is matching. And then the time grooming task, slow movement, reduced accuracy, just describing the impacts of the task the way you do in the objective section. And then for the assessment, performance demonstrates impaired sensory integration and reduced accuracy of force calibration, contributing to inefficient effort regulation, elevated perceived exertion, and decreased tolerance for basic ADL performance. And that assessment really puts everything in there. You don't have to say sensory attenuation specifically, sensory reweighting is specifically. They're all part of sensory integration, showing the impact on there's reduced accuracy of force calibration. They cannot accurately track the amount of force they're putting into things, so they can accurately regulate it. And then plan going forward, continue skill OT to improve occupational performance through graded ADL training, incorporating sensory integration strategies, force calibration activities, pacing techniques, setting that plan for treatment for yourself or the next therapist who's coming to see them, and trying to get that picture of post-stroke fatigue's impact from the neural mechanisms, showing how that impacts performance, and making that plan based off of those selected sensory processing impairments. So with that, the previous one being from the evaluation, here I just have an example of the potential progress note with the patient report still getting tired, but everyday tasks don't wear them down as quickly, with showing rates in grooming and meal preparation at an RPE of 5 to 6, which is a reduction from the evaluation, which is what we're looking for. And then we redo those same measures again. We have the modified CT SIB, improved postural stability with mild sway during eyes closed on compliant surface. Pressure matching test, target pressure 68, target pressure 60, reproduced pressure 68. So you see that level is getting closer and closer. Still off. There really isn't still, to my knowledge, a measurable level of how far off. Like I said, there's no average, nothing that I found. So you're just looking for that number to get closer. So for example, if you did RPE for the pressure matching with the blood pressure cuff, and the target pressure was a 60 and they rated it a 2 and they got a 68 and it was still a 2, or rated a 68 and it was a 3, not perfect, but that scaling is getting better. 3 is higher than 2, not matching, but 68 is higher than 60. So this still requires some level of clinical reasoning and you to be able to fully look and understand the whole picture of the patient, but this gives you a better idea of how to assess and measure sensory attenuation. Dynamometer force calibration, same thing, predicted effort 40, RPE 4, actual performance 34, RPE 5. Lower number, higher RPE, not as good as a change as the pressure matching. Time grooming, completed task without any breaks, improved movement speed and accuracy, mild increase in fatigue reported upon task completion. So essentially this is what we're looking for, those improvements. Just like with any other measure that we have, we're looking for those improvements over time. with the emphasis here being that with sensory attenuation, with the pressure matching, and we're using perceived effort as well, we're looking for the perceived efforts to get closer. Well, at the beginning, innately, in my opinion, we're looking at this perceived efforts at first. As things start to clear up, we're looking for accuracy and performance. We want those numbers on the dynamometer to match closer, on the blood pressure cuff to match closer, for the CT-SIB responses to be smaller, right? And for the task to get easier to do, both in precision and in effort. And so with this assessment, patient demonstrates improved sensory integration, force calibration, and regulation of perceived effort, resulting in greater efficiency and tolerance during ADL performance. We're showing the improvement based on these measurements of the sensory processing impairments that we have. Continued discrepancies between perceived and actual effort with sustained activity indicate ongoing deficits requiring skilled OT intervention. Proving why, yes, they're getting better, but why they still need our help. And then as you go into the plan, continue skill OT, ADL training, sensory integration, whatever they still need, whatever the issue is for the imbalance between the expected, the predicted, and the actual, whatever the gap is in the perceived effort, just illustrating that, making that clear in your documentation so that we can show what is going on. And eventually, this should lead to overall reduction in post-stroke fatigue. Likely not an elimination. Nobody is free of fatigue forever, even those who haven't had a stroke. But they are more able to regulate, take control of themselves and their faculties, participate fully in life, have greater autonomy, and chase the level of performance that they want to be at, and not live at the level of performance that they are stuck at. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this lecture series. I know it is a short lecture series, each one of these being a little bit over an hour. I appreciate the time you've spent hearing me ramble on about a passion project of mine. Post-stroke fatigue is a pervasive, insidious condition that too many people are living with, and I am happy to have a place in putting its treatment, making it more accurate, and bringing it to the forefront of occupational therapy so that we can make a better life for our patients. Thank you again.